So Richard was arrested again in June 1959, and in this part of his story, he's in a prison in the town of Gherla, sometime in the early 1960s. In a batch of new prisoners, I was shocked to see Professor Pope. He looked ill and he moved like an old man. We had not met after the amnesty of 1956, and my letters had gone unanswered. Pope explained why that evening. Like many other released prisoners, he had plunged into a hunt for pleasure. I felt starved, he said. I was afraid life had passed me by. I had to prove that I could enjoy myself again. I spent lavishly. I drank too much. I left my wife for a younger woman. Then I was sorry. I hadn't forgotten my Christian vows. I wanted to see you, but you were far away. I told everything to another pastor and blamed communism for destroying the country. He listened, then denounced me. Pope had been given another 12-year sentence. His first prison term had brought out all the strength and goodness in him. He had been like a seabird that rises highest on its wings in the face of the wind and falls as the wind falls. Now his will was weak. I tried to bring him back to God, but life seemed empty of meaning to him. He said that soon after his sentence, he had been informed of his civic burial. This was a new feature of life in the People's Republic. When a counter-revolutionary went to jail, his colleagues, friends, and family were gathered together by a party official who told them, "Comrades, this man is dead forever and for everyone. We are here to bury his memory." One by one, his offenses against the state had to be denounced by the mourners. Pope's widowed daughter spoke with the rest. Had she refused, she might have lost her job, and she was the mother of 2 young children. Pope was put to work with me on the second day. We had to clean the floor of the large cell, scrubbing it from end to end. A prisoner elected by the guards as a room leader walked up when we were almost finished and kicked over the bucket of dirty water, saying, "Now do it again." Finally, a guard came to inspect. He grabbed the room leader, bringing his face down towards some mud he had brought in on his own boots. "Filthy," he yelled. We scrubbed for another hour, to the accompaniment of kicks and insults from the room leader. There was no oppressor worse than the oppressed. This experience left Pope shaking with exhaustion. As a distraction, I introduced him over the meal to Pastor Gaston. A look of shock passed over Gaston's face. Pope simply turned away and closed his eyes. As the days passed, the professor withdrew further into himself. We had to urge him to eat and help him get ready each morning. He neither laughed nor wept, nor joined in the life of the cell. But one morning, stung by some jeering remark from the room leader, he seized the man's throat, clinging to it like a madman until 2 guards clubbed him down. He was carried unconscious to the hospital wing. Next day we heard that he was dead. The tragedy filled the cell with sorrow. While others prayed for Pope's soul, according to the Orthodox habit, Gaston lay in silence on his bunk, and when I spoke of eternal life, he rose and moved away. There was talk in the cell that evening of life after death. Gaston was asked what he thought on the question. "Progressive Unitarians don't believe in a supernatural survival," he said. "But we are not talking to progressive Unitarians," I replied. "We're talking to you. Let's have the courage to be ourselves, not always we Catholics, we Protestants, we Romanians." Speaking personally, then, I don't believe in it. "If you are speaking personally," I said, "that is the first step to believing. For personality is God's greatest gift to man, the one thing that remains as your body changes. The atoms of oxygen and hydrogen in my body are the same as in yours. My body's heat can be measured on the same instrument as yours. All bodily energies, chemical, electrical, are alike from man to man. But my thoughts, my feelings, my will are my own. Physical energy is like a poker chip, which has no mark on it. Spiritual energy is like a coin that bears the head of a king. Why, then, should it share the body's fate? Florescu, who had drawn up a stool, said, with an obscenity, I believe in what I can see, taste, and feel. We're all matter, like this bit of wood I'm sitting on, and when you're dead, that's it. I went over and kicked the stool from under him. It shot across the floor, and Florescu went down with a bump. He scrambled up furiously and made for me, but the others held him. What's the idea? He snarled. I replied mildly, but you said you were matter like the stool. I didn't hear the stool complain. There was some laughter, in which even Gaston joined. I'm sorry, Florescu, I said. I just wanted to prove that since matter does not react with love or hate, it is, after all, different from us. Florescu sulked for a while, then interrupted again. I might believe if the dead ever came back to talk to us. I am sure that men have been in touch with the dead, I replied. Great scientists from Newton to Sir Oliver Lodge have believed in spiritualism. The Bible describes the evocation of the dead king's soul. Scriptures forbid it, but say it is possible. The row over the stool had brought others to listen, and I began to preach earnestly about life after death. It was for us no academic matter, but a topic of burning and immediate interest. Men died every day in Gherla. If God had made us for this life only, I said, he would first have given us age with its wisdom, then youth with its vigor. It seems senseless to gather knowledge and understanding simply to take it to the grave. Luther compares our life on earth to the life of an unborn child. He says that if the embryo could reason in the womb, it would wonder why it grew hands and feet, and it would surely come to the conclusion that there must be another world to come in which it would play and run and work, Just as the embryo is preparing for a future state, so are we. I forgot the guards and raised my voice to preach to prisoners lying in bunks that rose in tiers to the ceiling. Eyes watched me in the dim light, which the weak bulb hanging above us seemed to make still more dismal. I said, suppose I argue that there is room in a pint bottle for 10 pints of milk. You would say I was mad. Yet I can have together in my head thoughts of an event like the flood, which happened thousands of years ago, of my wife and son in the room where I left them, of God and the devil. How does it happen that within the narrow limits of my head there are encompassed the daily things of life, and the infinite and the eternal? The illimitable must be contained by something illimitable. This is the spirit. When your unfettered spirit can go anywhere in time or space, do you believe that it can share the fate of this husk, which is the body? While I spoke of these things, there was a silence such as is never heard in church. No one yawned or fidgeted, no thoughts strayed. The prisoners, in soiled clothes, their cheeks hollow and their eyes big with hunger, received the thought of survival after death as thirsty soil receives rain. Next day, before reveille, I woke to find Gaston's bunk empty. Then I saw the outline of his frail body at the window. I threw a blanket round my shoulders and joined him. We looked down through the bars. The light was ashen. Mist hung in the yard, but we could see a row of black coffins lying by the main gate. They contained men who had died in the last 24 hours. One would be Pope. This was a daily scene at Gherla, and I wondered why Gaston had chosen this day to rise and watch. I tried to get him back to bed, but he would not move. Under our eyes, a guard crossed the yard and raised the lids of the coffins, exposing the bodies. Behind him came a hulking figure with a steel stake in his hand. He lifted it and plunged the steel into each corpse in turn. God rest their souls, I said. The guards were making sure that no life remained and that no would-be escapees had replaced the bodies. Gaston was trembling. I put the blanket around him, but he continued to stand watching while the coffins were closed and loaded onto the lorry, which would take them to the Rosa Sandor cemetery. For days after this, Gaston brooded. Whatever was on his mind, he would not reveal it to us. He rebuffed all my attempts to break into his misery. In the evenings, he would listen to the others exchanging stories, but only once did he contribute one himself. The prisoners exchanged glances. He had been silent and morose so long that they did not know what to expect. He said, "I was sitting in a restaurant just before my arrest. I thought it would raise my spirits to have a good meal. So I hung my overcoat by a corner table and ordered all the things I liked. Another customer nearby looked at me in a worried way and rose to speak, but I waved him away. 'Please,' I said, 'we all have our troubles, and I should like to dine in peace.' The meal was good. I lit a cigar and thought I should apologize for being uncivil. I asked the man's pardon and said perhaps he would like to tell me the trouble now. 'Too late,' he said. 'The stove's burnt a hole in your overcoat.' Gaston's story won some laughter, but he went back to his bunk and lay down in the darkness. At one period, Gaston had spent hours telling us how he honored Christ as the greatest teacher, but not as God, and what the Unitarians accepted as true in the Bible and what not. Their reappraisal did not leave much to hold on to. They were not over-concerned with eternal life, he said. But now he began to talk again about Professor Pope. What proof was there that anything remained after the horrible scene we had watched together that dawn? The male human creature, he said, needed 4 things to survive: food, warmth, sleep, a woman companion. And the last can be dispensed with, he added. My wife's gone to live with another man. Our 2 children are in a state home. You yourself don't believe this, I said. We live here on the very minimum of these things, yet every day you hear laughter and men singing. Their bodies have nothing to sing about. It's something else in them that sings. You believe in the soul, don't you? What the ancient Egyptians called Ka, the Greeks psyche, the Hebrews neshama. Why else do you worry about your children's upbringing? If it will all be over for them in a few decades, what do any of us want with religion or morals or decency? It's too late, he said. I can't change now. My life has been smoldering away like my coat in that restaurant, and people have tried to warn me before, but it's gone too far at last. I've nothing to live for, and the only thing that keeps me from suicide is that I'm scared of death. I kept a piece of glass the other day. I meant to slash my wrists, but I didn't have the courage. I said, suicide proves nothing except that the soul is strong and independent enough to kill the body for its own reasons. Even if you were free and had all you wanted, you might feel this way. It's terrible about your wife and children, but I feel there is something else troubling you, something you've not told anyone. Gaston was silent. I continued, I knew a prisoner who knowingly starved himself to give bread to his son who was in jail with him until he died of malnutrition. That's how strong the soul is. A man like Kruger, the Swedish match millionaire who had everything the body can possibly need, killed himself, leaving a note that spoke of melancholia. He had had something else in the body, the soul for which he had not cared. But you have inner resources. You have Christianity to help you. Speak to Jesus. He will give you comfort and strength. Gaston sighed in the darkness. You make it sound as if he was here with us, alive. Certainly he's alive, I said. Don't you believe even in the resurrection? Tomorrow I'll prove it to you. How you persist, he said. You're worse than a communist. While the prisoners were talking next evening, I reminded them that Easter was approaching, my second in Gherla. If we had any hard-boiled eggs, we could dye them red and crack them together, according to the Orthodox custom, I said. I held out my hand as if offering an Easter egg and said, Christ is risen. Old Vasilescu, one of the farmers, hit my fist with his own and cried, He is risen indeed. A chorus of voices echoed the traditional response. That's a strange thing to say, I said, turning to the others. Surely Christ died on the cross. What proof have you that he is risen?" There was a silence. Vasilescu tugged at his heavy mustaches. "I'm a simple farmer, but I believe it because my father and mother and his father and all our priests and teachers told me so. I believe it because I see how nature is resurrected every year. When the snow is on the ground, you can't ever believe that the fields will bear crops in spring. But the trees bud and the air grows warm and the grass green. If the world can come alive again, so can Christ." "A sound answer," said Miron. "But in a world where every Christian assertion is challenged, that's not enough," said Gaston. "We need the strongest proofs, I agree," I said, "and they exist. Mommsen, the great historian of the Roman Empire, calls the resurrection the best proven fact in history. Do you believe the classical historians were largely truthful?" No one argued. They were usually courtiers, the flatterers of kings, men who praised for profit or to please powerful protectors. How much more should we believe Paul or Peter, Matthew, Andrew, apostles who died a martyr's death to spread the truth? I asked Major Brelianu, "When you served on courts-martial, did you take account of a witness's character as well as his words?" "Of course," he replied. "In a clash of evidence, it is all important." "Then we must credit the apostles on that ground, for they spent their time doing and preaching good." "It's miracles like the feeding of the 5,000 with 5 fishes that stretch my belief," said the major. "What is a miracle?" I asked. Missionaries from Africa say they are at first received as miracle workers. The primitive tribesman is astounded to see a match struck. Pearl Buck told women in a remote part of China that in her own country carriages moved without horses. "What a liar," they whispered. So a miracle is simply something a superior creature can do, and Jesus was a man of exceptional powers. Gaston objected. A primitive man might accept such a thing. It remains hard for a rationalist. It is rational to believe that Christ rose from the dead. Otherwise, we must accept the impossible, that the Church, which has survived the external assaults and internal corruptions of 2,000 years, is built on a lie. Only consider that Jesus, in his lifetime, organized no church, wrote no books. He had a handful of poor disciples, and one of these betrayed him for money, while the rest fled or denied him when the test came. He died on the cross crying, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" His tomb was closed with a huge stone. "Not a hopeful start," said Brelianu. "Then how do you explain that it led to a world religion?" "The disciples came together again," said Gaston doubtfully. "But what gave them the power to preach and to die for their faith?" "They overcame their fear in time, I suppose." "Yes, they say how they mastered it. On the 3rd day, Christ appeared in person and gave them courage. Peter, who had been frightened by a housemaid, stood in Jerusalem and declared that he and his brethren had seen and spoken with Christ, that he had risen indeed. Peter said they might kill him before he denied it again. So the Romans did." "Was it rational to believe," I asked, "that Peter and the disciples went to be crucified for a liar?" "Peter gave his first sermon about the resurrection 500 yards from the empty tomb. He knew that the facts could not be contradicted, and no one among Christ's enemies attempted to do so." "Why was Saul of Tarsus so easily converted by his vision of Christ reproaching him on the road to Damascus?" "Saul was the scourge of Christianity," I said. "It may have been an auditory and visual hallucination," said Brelianu. "Paul knew about these things. An apparition is no argument to an expert like him. He yielded so quickly and completely because, as a member of the Sanhedrin, he knew the great secret, that the tomb was empty." Miran had sat sewing a patch on his trousers as we talked. He raised his intense, luminous eyes to Gaston and said, "Years ago I had a postcard from my brother in New York, who had been to the top of the Empire State Building. He didn't investigate the foundations first, Pastor Gaston. The fact that it had been there 40 years is proof that the foundations are good. The same with the truth, the same with the church, which has rested 2,000 years on the truth. Our arguments had an effect on Gaston. His pain was eased and his faith deepened. The wish to kill himself faded as the weeks passed, but still he seemed to carry a load of guilt. The summer brought a fresh influx of prisoners. We were moved into different cells, and I lost sight of him. Months went by, and I preached and worked in a dozen cells at Gherla. I was often punished, and it was because of a beating that I met Gaston again. We were playing chess in the cell with figures made out of pieces of bread one day when Wurmbrand, who still prowled the corridors, burst in. "I'll have no gambling," he bellowed. I suggested that chess was a game of skill, not chance. The commandant expanded his chest. "Cha! Ridiculous! Skill is also a matter of chance." Pleased with this answer, he strutted away. When he had gone, the prisoners burst into laughter and started to mimic his voice. The door crashed open again. Wurmbrand had been eavesdropping. "Wurmbrand, out you come." Others were ordered out with me. "You'll laugh on the other side of your faces this time," shouted the commandant. We received 25 strokes each, and afterwards were moved to an isolation cell. There, alone on a bunk, lying face down, I found Gaston. He too had been beaten. His back was a mass of bloody wounds. We tried to ease the pain with applications of a shirt soaked in water, and when the worst was past, I examined the raw flesh for splinters of wood. His body shook as if in a fever. He could not speak much at first, but slowly, in broken phrases, he explained that he had been punished for preaching. A prisoner had informed on him. He said, "I want to tell you something." "You mustn't talk." "No, now or never. About Professor Pope and the pastor who betrayed him." He stopped, his lips trembling. "You needn't tell me," I began. "I couldn't stand the pressure. I've suffered. When he died," he began to sob. We prayed together. He said that he could never forgive himself. "The professor didn't. How could anyone?" he asked. "Of course they can. So would Pope if he had known everything," I said. "Let me tell you about a man who was far worse than you. It will help us to pass the night. He was the murderer of my wife's family. She forgave him, and he became one of our closest friends. There are only 2 men my wife kisses, her husband and the man who murdered her family." I told Gaston the story. When Romania entered the war on Germany's side, a pogrom began in which many thousands of Jews were killed or deported. At Iași alone, 11,000 were massacred in a day. My wife, who shares my Protestant faith, is also of Jewish origin. We lived in Bucharest, from which the Jews were not deported, but her parents, one of her brothers, 3 sisters, and other relatives who lived in Bukovini were taken to Transnistria, a wild border province which the Romanians had captured from Russia. Jews who were not murdered at the end of this journey were left to starve, and there Sabina's family died. I had to break this news. She recovered herself and said, "I will not weep. You are entitled to a happy wife, and Mihai to a happy mother, and our church to a servant with courage." If she shed tears in private, I do not know, but from that day I never saw Sabina weep again. Some time later, our landlord, a good Christian, told me sadly of a man who was staying in the house while on leave from the front. "I knew him before the war," he said, "but he's changed completely. He has become a brute who likes to boast of how he volunteered to exterminate Jews in Transnistria and killed hundreds with his own hands." I was deeply distressed, and I decided to pass the night in prayer. To avoid disturbing Sabina, who was unwell and who would have wished to join in my vigil in spite of that, I went upstairs after supper to the landlord's flat to pray with him. Lounging in an armchair was a giant of a man whom the landlord introduced as Gherla, the killer of Jews from Transnistria. When he rose, he was even taller than I, and there seemed to be about him an aura of horror that was like a smell of blood. Soon he was telling us of all his adventures in the war and of the Jews he had slaughtered. "It is a frightening story," I said, "but I do not fear for the Jews. God will compensate them for what they have suffered. I ask myself with anguish what will happen to the murderers when they stand before God's judgment." An ugly scene was prevented by the landlord, who said that we were both guests in his house, and turned the talk into more neutral channels. The murderer proved to be not only a murderer. Nobody is only one thing. He was a pleasant talker, and eventually it came out that he had a great love of music. He mentioned that while serving in the Ukraine, he had been captivated by the songs there. "I wish I could hear them again," he said. I knew some of these old songs. I thought to myself, looking at Gherla, "The fish has entered my net." "If you'd like to hear some of them," I told him, "come to my flat. I'm no pianist, but I can play a few Ukrainian melodies." The landlord, his wife, and daughter accompanied us. My wife was in bed. She was used to my playing softly at night and did not wake up. I played the folk songs, which were alive with feeling, and I could see that Gherla was deeply moved. I remembered how, when King Saul was afflicted by an evil spirit, the boy David had played the harp before him. I stopped and turned to Gherla. "I've something very important to say to you," I told him. "Please speak," he said. "If you look through that curtain, you can see someone is asleep in the next room. It's my wife, Sabina. Her parents, her sisters, and her 12-year-old brother have been killed with the rest of the family. You told me that you had killed hundreds of Jews near Gherla, and that is where they were taken." Looking into his eyes, I added, "You yourself don't know who you have shot, so we can assume that you are the murderer of her family." He jumped up, his eyes blazing, looking as if he were about to strangle me. I held my hand up and said, "Now, let's try an experiment. I shall wake my wife and tell her who you are and what you have done. I can tell you what will happen. My wife will not speak one word of reproach. She'll embrace you as if you were her brother. She'll bring you supper, the best thing she has in the house. Now, if Sabina, who is a sinner like us all, can forgive and love like this, imagine how Jesus, who is perfect love, can forgive and love you. Only return to him, and everything you have done will be forgiven." Gherla was not heartless. Within, he was consumed by guilt and misery at what he had done, and he had shaken his brutal talk at us as a crab its claws. One tap at his weak spot, and his defenses crumbled. The music had already moved his heart, and now came, instead of the attack he expected, words of forgiveness. His reaction was amazing. He jumped up and tore at his collar with both hands so that his shirt was rent apart. "Oh God, what shall I do? What shall I do?" he cried. He put his head in his hands and sobbed noisily as he rocked himself back and forth. "I'm a murderer. I'm soaked in blood. What shall I do?" Tears ran down his cheeks. I cried, "In the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, I command the devil of hatred to go out of your soul." Gherla fell on his knees trembling, and we began to pray aloud. He knew no prayers. He simply asked again and again for forgiveness and said that he hoped and knew it would be granted. We were on our knees together for some time. Then we stood up and embraced each other, and I said, "I promised to make an experiment. I shall keep my word." I went into the other room and found my wife still sleeping calmly. She was very weak and exhausted at that time. I woke her gently and said, "There is a man here whom you must meet. We believe he has murdered your family, but he has repented, and now he is our brother." She came out in her dressing gown and put out her arms to embrace him. Then both began to weep and to kiss each other again and again. I have never seen bride and bridegroom kiss with such love and passion and purity as this murderer and the survivor among his victims. Then, as I foretold, Sabina went to the kitchen to bring him food. While she was away, the thought came to me that Gherla's crime had been so terrible that some further lesson was needed. I went to the next room and returned with my son Mihai, who was then 2, asleep in my arms. It was only a few hours since Gherla had boasted to us how he had killed Jewish children in their parents' arms, and now he was horrified. The sight was an unbearable reproach. He expected me to accuse him, but I said, "Do you see how quietly he sleeps? You are also like a newborn child who can rest in the Father's arms. The blood that Jesus shed has cleansed you." Gherla's happiness was very moving. He stayed with us that night, and when he awoke the next day, he said, "It's a long time since I slept like that." St. Augustine says, "Anima humana naturaliter Christiana est." The human soul is naturally Christian. Crime is against one's own nature, the result of social pressure or many other causes, and what a relief it is to cast it off as he had done. That morning, Gherla wanted to meet our Jewish friends, and I took him to many Hebrew Christian homes. Everywhere he told his story, and he was received as the returning prodigal son. Then, with the New Testament which I gave him, he went to join his regiment in another town. Gherla later came to say that his unit had been ordered to the front. "What shall I do?" he asked. "I'll have to start killing again." I said, "No, you've killed more than a soldier needs to already. I don't mean that a Christian shouldn't defend his country if it is attacked, but you, personally, shouldn't kill any more. Better allow others to kill you. The Bible doesn't forbid that." As I told the story, Gaston grew quieter. At the end, he smiled and reached out to clasp my hand, and so he fell into an untroubled sleep. In the morning, we were moved back together into another cell. Among the prisoners, I found Grigor, who was also a war criminal responsible for massacring Jews. He knew Gherla. I told Gaston, "There's an epilogue to the story of the man who killed my wife's family. This man can tell it to you." Grigor explained how he had served with Gherla in Transnistria, where they had massacred the Jews. "When we went to Russia again, he was a changed man," he said. "We couldn't understand it. He put aside his weapons, and instead of taking lives, he saved them. He volunteered to rescue the wounded under fire, and in the end, he saved his officer." The months turned into years. 2 had gone by, and except that the faces came and went, all else remained the same. Prison made of some men saints and of others brutes, and it was difficult to tell who would be saint and who brute. But one thing was sure, that the majority of prisoners would go on living, as it were, in a vacuum. They sprawled on their bunks, hour after hour, with nothing to do. Talk became the whole of life. I wondered what would happen if science should ever make work unnecessary. There is a limit to innovation in sex, films, and other drugs, and so many have nothing else in their minds. As my 3rd year in Gherla progressed, things eased a little. We gained a little more freedom of speech, a few more mouthfuls of food. Conditions outside were changing again, we gathered. We did not know in what way, nor that the greatest trial still lay ahead.